I'm G.L. Robinson, the author of historical romances available on Amazon.com. The first is entitled Imogen or Love and Money. The second is Cecilia or Too Tall to Love. And the third will be out on the 2nd of May, Rosemary or Too Clever to Love. I'm going to read the first two chapters of Rosemary. If you want to listen to the first two chapters of the other two books, you can on my website, which is romancenovels.glrobinson.com. So this is the first two chapters of Rosemary or Too Clever to Love. Chapter 1. You will move to High House at the end of the month, announced Giles de Mornay, 3rd Earl of Wyburn. It's the only solution. He looked critically at the woman in front of him. She was rather above average height, but it was impossible to tell if she had a shape. Her dowdy, ill-fitting round gown in a colour somewhere between grey and brown was the ugliest garb he had ever seen, and her black cap, pulled tightly over her forehead with her hair braided tightly so that not a single strand escaped, was the least becoming item of headwear imaginable. She could have been anywhere between 20 and 40. Miss Drover nodded, her head down. His lordship was not, of course, asking her opinion, and it was the only solution, she supposed. "I'll tell Marianne," she said quietly. "Her father's death has been such a shock. It will be hard for her to have to leave her home as well." If his lordship heard her comment, he ignored it. "I'll send a carriage for your things," he said. "You and Marianne will travel with me in my post-chaise. I trust 3 weeks will be long enough for you to put your affairs in order?" "Yes, my lord," replied Miss Drover. "That will be no problem." "Good, I'll leave it to you then. You may expect me on the 30th before noon. Please make sure you're both ready. I don't like to be kept waiting." With that, the Earl turned towards the door, drawing on his riding gloves and calling to Woolson the butler to have his curricle brought round. The news of the death of Mr. Anthony Fairchild, Marianne's father, had hit them like a bombshell. He had died of an apoplexy while away in London. That it had occurred in the arms of his mistress was a detail which had not been conveyed to his daughter and her governess. It was true he had never been a very present father. After his young wife had died giving birth to Marianne, he had spent very little time at his country estate, evidently preferring the lively company of London society to the staid existence in the country with his daughter. She had been first left in the charge of a nanny, but then, 5 years ago, when she was 10, Rosemary Drover had come to be her governess. They had become very close, with Rosemary her friend and almost mother, though the age difference between them was under 10 years. It had crossed Rosemary's mind that the Earl would consider Marianne old enough to go off and pay her off as a governess, but so far, thank goodness, there had been no mention of that. To be left an orphan at 15 was a shock for anyone, but it now appeared that Marianne was to move from the only home she had ever known and go to live on the estate of her guardian, Lord Wyburn, her mother's older brother. Her father's estate was entailed away to a cousin, who would be arriving with his family any day to take possession of his inheritance. Apparently he was blessed with 2 daughters of his own, one just 14 and the other almost 12, and obviously did not want to be saddled with another girl to bring out when the time came. Hearing the front door slam behind the departing Earl, Miss Drover left the drawing-room and went slowly towards the stairs. She would have to explain to Marianne again how it was they had to leave. Now they had a fixed date for their departure, there would be much to do. Marianne was not left penniless. She had inherited her mother's fortune, which, while not a king's ransom, was handsome enough, though it was to be administered by her uncle the Earl, until she came of age or married with his consent. Along with the fortune there were various household items, always referred to as her ladyship's, as for example, her ladyship's writing desk, which resided in the breakfast room, her ladyship's mirror, which hung in the hall, her ladyship's fire screen in front of the fire in the salon, and all the items in her ladyship's bedchamber. These would have to come with them when they left. In fact, thinking about it now, Rosemary realised that a carriage would hardly be sufficient for it all. She should have mentioned it. But remembering his lordship's cool assumption of control, she hardly knew when a moment would have been right to tell him anything. She would write him a letter and let him make whatever arrangements he thought suitable. After a brief knock at the door, she went into Marianne's room. This still had the look of a child's bedchamber, with its narrow bed and gingham hangings and framed Bible texts on the walls. Indeed, her charge and she had laughed over it only recently, Marianne declaring that it was time for something more adult. At 15, she was a well-developed girl of no more than average height, very fair, with unexpectedly deep brown eyes fringed with black lashes. Her attractiveness came as much from a vivacity of character as from her undeniably pretty face. "After all, I shall be 16 next year and grown up," she had said. "I should like a huge bed with red silk hangings, a crystal chandelier, and a vast gold-framed mirror. Don't you think that would be fine, Rosemary, darling?" "No, I don't, and I'm quite sure your papa would not think so either. It sounds most improper." "Oh, stuff! As for papa, he'll give me anything I ask for. You know he will." It was true. Though he rarely came to his country estate, or perhaps just because his visits were so infrequent, Marianne's father was inclined to indulge her when he did put in an appearance. When she turned her beseeching gaze upon him, he was putty in her hands. He would pat her cheek, sigh at how much she looked like her mother, and give her what she asked, so long as he didn't have to dig too deeply in his pockets to do so. And now he was gone, that amiable, slightly stooped figure, still showing the signs of the handsome man he had once been before the excesses of London had raddled his face and ruined his physique. Marianne was lying on her narrow bed, the ruffled pink and white covers a contrast to her pale cheeks and red eyes. "Has my uncle gone at last?" she asked. "I just couldn't bear to come down. He probably thought I was entirely lacking in manners, but I just couldn't. I don't know why he should be my guardian. I don't think he even likes me." "Yes, he has gone. He didn't seem to mind that you weren't there, but not, I think, because he dislikes you in particular. I have the impression he doesn't care for any of us. He just gave me instructions that we are to be ready to move to High House in 3 weeks." 3 weeks? I'm to leave my beloved home forever in 3 weeks? Oh, it's so unfair. Why should Bernard have it? He's never been here above 3 or 4 times in his whole life. She burst into tears and buried her head in her pillow. Her governess sat beside her, stroking her back until the spasms had passed. When it was over, they were both silent for several minutes, each sunk in their own thoughts. Rosemary Drover knew well how Marianne felt. She too had been forced to leave her home forever, and under even worse circumstances. Her father had been the rector of a country parish, and her mother the daughter of a gentleman of ancient lineage but no money. She had never known either of her mother's parents, as they had died while she was still an infant. The only concrete thing she still had from them was a locket given her by her mother with pieces of their hair on either side. But she had more practical reasons to be grateful to her maternal grandparents. They had made sure that their daughter, Rosemary's mother, was well educated. She had learned history and geography, as well as French and passable Italian. She could write in a fine hand, draw, sew, and play the pianoforte. However, while her mother's ability had never been anything but moderate on that instrument, Rosemary had inherited her grandmother's very considerable talent. This, together with the education that her mother had passed on to her, proved to be a lifesaver. 5 years before, both her parents, along with a good number of the parishioners, including a young farmer who had been paying marked attention to the rector's daughter, succumbed to a virulent fever that had swept through the country and had died within a few days of each other. Just 17 at the time, she had been forced not only to leave the rectory that had been her home her whole life, but also to find a way to earn her keep. Luck, if such it can be called after the disastrous experience of losing her parents and her probable future husband at one swoop, was with her. The local squire knew Anthony Fairchild in London, and when he heard that gentleman bemoaning the fact that he had to find a governess for his 10-year-old daughter, he suggested Rosemary Drover. He knew her, he said, to be a very pretty-behaved young woman, with no pretensions to beauty, for he did not admire her slim figure and open countenance with its fine, brown-grey eyes. His taste ran to something more opulent altogether. And she knew as much as any young woman might be expected to know, and could, besides, play a fine tune on the piano. The thing was arranged. Knowing that her youth would be a disadvantage, Miss Drover had put on her dowdiest gown, pulled her naturally curly, abundant chestnut hair into tight braids wound around her head, covered it with a matronly cap and unbecoming black bonnet, and presented herself at Fairchild Court. Her appearance had produced the desired effect. No one even asked her age, and the very decided way she answered the questions made her appear much older, with the result she had been engaged on the spot. It had in fact been lucky for both sides. Rosemary had found a new home, and Marianne a governess who, besides being actually able to teach her something, was also the daughter of a gentlewoman. She could inculcate society manners in his daughter, who was inclined to be impulsive. When Mr. Fairchild came home on his infrequent trips, he found a daughter who could make a pretty curtsy, recite a French poem charmingly, locate all the counties of England on the map, find India on the globe, and play a simple tune on the piano. If her scholarship had never amounted to much more than that, it wasn't for want of Miss Drover's trying. She and her mother had often discussed the writings of Descartes and Pascal, and she attempted to engage Marianne similarly. However, Marianne was inclined to think that anything written over 100 years ago must be so completely out of date that it wasn't worth reading. In vain did Rosemary argue the opposite. Much more to her pupil's taste was the long novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, left behind by a visitor and devoured by Marianne before Miss Drover had a chance to prevent it. This undesirable reading matter had, however, so entrenched itself in her charge's mind that now she sat up suddenly and said, "Oh, I am just like poor Emily. I'm orphaned, as she was, but instead of being forced to live with an unloved aunt, I have to live with an unloved uncle. I'm sure he will try to make me marry some awful old friend of his. Oh, Rosie dearest, you must protect me." In spite of the misgivings she too felt about the move, Miss Drover had to laugh. "Yes, and he'll probably put you in a tower if you refuse, and you'll have to climb down the ivy-covered walls and escape on a snow-white horse." When Marianne looked mutinous, she continued, "Don't be silly, love. His lordship will probably have nothing to do with us at all, and we'll be able to carry on in our usual way. I'm sure he has much more important things to do than imprison innocent females. I dare say we'll hardly ever see him." But Marianne was deriving woeful satisfaction from seeing herself as the unfortunate heroine of a Gothic story, and nothing Miss Drover could do or say would make her get up and do something more useful. Rosemary buried her own doubts about their new life in organizing the household to receive its new master and mistress. Once it had become clear that Marianne had gone as far as she could with her schooling, apart from urging her, often unsuccessfully, to practice the piano once a day, and having her read out loud chapters from such books and articles as might improve that maiden's mind, Miss Drover had turned her energies towards the running of the home. Her mother had been a very provident housekeeper, saying that no lady should be too proud to run a comfortable home for her family. Rosemary had learned at her side. The old housekeeper at Fairchild Court had been forced to retire to a cottage on the estate when her rheumatics made it impossible to fulfil her duties, and Miss Drover had stepped in. It was she who ordered the candles, fuel, and dry goods for the house, who supervised the linen cupboard and had the thinning sheets turned end to middle, who organized the annual spring cleaning and the taking down of the dusty old draperies for a good beating. It was she who, in a word, kept Fairchild Court looking as well as a property might that had had scarcely a groat spent on it in nearly a decade. It's doubtful whether Mr. Fairchild noticed a thing. He certainly did not seem to find it amiss that it was the governess who spoke to him about the smoking chimney in the library and the need to have it swept, or who informed him that the new hay ordered for the stables had proved mouldy and had to be sent back. The servants, too, became accustomed to taking their orders from Miss Drover, and when Mr. Fairchild invited guests for the shooting in the autumn, were perfectly ready to do her behest in everything. She hired extra maids from the village who washed, ironed, and starched all the table linens, including the darned napkins for the breakfast trays, and polished all the furniture and what remained of the silver until it shone. She now directed the footman to remove her ladyship's possessions from where they presently stood, and place them in a dry shed, protected by holland covers. She thought it best to do this before the new owners arrived, so that there should be no embarrassment. This left the mistress's bedroom totally empty. The attic yielded an old bed and washstand that could be refurbished sufficiently for use, and Rosemary mended the old silk hangings as best she could, hoping the new lady of the house would not find too much to complain about. Her ladyship's desk had stood for years in the same spot in the breakfast room, which looked odd without it, but the newcomers would not know that. Likewise the fire screen, which would hardly be noticed by its absence. The removal of the mirror from the hall, however, left a distinct mark of its shape on the wall. She ordered the wall to be washed with a dilute chloride of lime, which did something to remove the outline, but also had the effect of making the wall look lighter than the rest. As with the bedroom furniture, she just hoped that in the first flurry of arrival no one would notice. But in this she was to be undeceived. Chapter 2. Mildred Fairchild, the cousin's wife, could not believe her fortune in having married a man who was now to inherit a country estate and what was left of the fortune to maintain it. The daughter of a well-to-do grocer, she had grown up in a household that boasted a cook and a couple of overworked maids, and as a married lady had run her own home along the same lines. She was now to be mistress of a large home which, in addition to the help she was accustomed to, boasted 2 footmen and a butler. She immediately adopted the airs of a grande dame and infuriated her contemporaries so much by constant reference to herself as the Lady of Fairchild Court that they were heartily glad to see the back of her when at last the lumbering coach conveyed them thither. Her husband, Bernard Fairchild, was a hesitant, cowed gentleman who could never quite remember whether he had actually offered for Mildred or whether she had simply acted as if he had until it was too late for him to withdraw. His anticipation of being Mr. Fairchild of Fairchild Court was as far removed from his wife's as possible. He was, in fact, terrified. As the coach swept between the high wrought iron gates that, due to rusty hinges, hung permanently open, Miss Drover called for the staff to line up to receive their new master and mistress, and for Marianne to stand with her just inside the front door. When it drew to a halt, Wilson, the butler, stepped forward, and as Mr. Fairchild came to help his wife down, bowed with great solemnity to them both. "Welcome to Fairchild Court, Mrs. Fairchild, Mr. Fairchild." To the 2 young ladies who followed them, he bowed with slightly less solemnity before ushering in the whole party. Marianne, propelled forward by Rosemary, curtsied to the couple who had arrived to force her out of her home, and offered them each her hand, and then introduced her governess. She welcomed the 2 young ladies who stood goggle-eyed at the wide entrance hall. This was probably the finest aspect of Fairchild Court, especially in the dim light of an early spring afternoon, with a fire blazing in the wide stone hearth, and branched chandeliers throwing a warm light on the rather dilapidated furnishings. Wilson then performed the introductions to the rest of the staff. Mrs. Fairchild looked at them all down her not inconsiderable nose, and her husband shuffled behind, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You must be tired after your journey, ma'am," said Marianne at last, using the formula taught her by Rosemary. "Would you like to lie down, or may I have tea brought into the salon?" "Oh, I'm never tired when there's work to be done," responded Mrs. Fairchild in a very determined manner, "which I see there must be, to judge from the shocking condition of these walls. Why, this one," pointing to the place where the mirror had recently been removed, "is positively a different colour from the rest. Before I even have a sip of tea, I should like to see the rest of the house. But where is my housekeeper? No one with that duty has been presented to me." Rosemary stepped forward. "We have no housekeeper as such, ma'am. I have been performing these duties in recent years, since Miss Marianne's schooling has come almost to an end." "You, Miss Drover?" replied the new mistress with some hauteur. "How very irregular! I cannot have a governess as my housekeeper. Besides, I shall be needing you for the instruction of my girls, though I'm sure you will find them educated to a level beyond what one may find here in the country. Dear Miss Oswald, their governess, whom we unfortunately had to leave behind, was possessed of a most superior intellect." She did not mention that Miss Oswald was nearly 60, and because of her failing eyesight had barely opened a book in the last few years. She had declared herself unable to move away at her time of life, preferring to go and live with her sister instead. "I think there is some misunderstanding, ma'am," replied Rosemary swiftly. "I am to leave with Miss Marianne. She will need a chaperone and a companion at her uncle's house, but if you wish to engage a housekeeper before we leave, I will be glad to show her how we go on." Mrs. Fairchild sniffed and said nothing, but allowed herself to be led upstairs by Rosemary. The two girls trailed behind. Meanwhile, Marianne led Mr. Fairchild into the salon, where she invited him to sit by the fire, and asked Wilson to bring him whatever he might desire. She then spent a difficult hour trying to converse with a man who had no conversation, no opinion, and no social manners. All of Rosemary's training was put to the test as Marianne tried to find one subject after another that might elicit more than "I really could not say," or "I shall have to ask Mrs. Fairchild." Rosemary, who had already formed a fair assessment of the new mistress of Fairchild Court, thought she had best take the bull by the horns and show her immediately the denuded bedchamber that would be hers. When Rosemary explained that her ladyship's bedchamber furniture belonged to Marianne, and had been removed prior to transportation to its new home, that lady's shock and disgust found immediate expression. "But it's not to be believed! Surely the items in the mistress's bedchamber must necessarily belong to the estate. I shall have my husband look into it at once. I cannot permit anything to be removed before investigation. It's not to be expected that the lady of the house should sleep in this old stuff. It's only fit for the bonfire." While Rosemary agreed that the bed and washstand were old, she found herself wanting to defend the bed linens and hangings, which she had spent time and effort refurbishing. The colours were faded, to be sure, but washed and ironed, the almost grey pink looked quite pretty, she thought. And she had chosen the best of the lace-edged pillow slips and sheets for Mrs. Fairchild. They were thin, but very fine. But Mrs. Fairchild was not to be mollified. "I demand that the original furnishings be returned," she declared. "I shall not sleep even one night in this." "I'm afraid that will not be possible, ma'am," replied Rosemary equally firmly, and telling nothing less than the absolute truth. "They have already been packed up for transportation and are no longer in the house." Mrs. Fairchild stared at her for a minute, but as she met her gaze with perfect equanimity, The mistress evidently decided that nothing more could be done for the moment, but she was not satisfied. Nor was she satisfied with the contents of the linen cupboard. Rosemary had been making do and mending ever since she had been in the house, as Marianne's father was adamant that he would not spend money on what he called damn linens and furbelows that no man could possibly care about. The contents of the linen cupboard were consequently in sorry shape. "I suppose you will tell me that the sheets have also been removed, Miss Marianne," said Mrs. Fairchild acidly. "No, indeed, ma'am," replied Rosemary. "We have been sleeping on ends to middle sheets for these last 2 or 3 years. You will find I have had the only unrepaired ones put on your and Mr. Fairchild's beds, but I'm afraid the young ladies will find theirs as uncomfortable as ours." Since the 2 ladies of the house, the 2 daughters of the house, had never been allowed the luxury of unrepaired sheets, they muttered something about being accustomed to it, but their mother swiftly hushed them. The tour of the upstairs was continued and completed, with Mrs. Fairchild demanding to see every room, including those where Marianne and Rosemary slept, next to the nursery. Some guardian angel had prompted Rosemary to have even the unused rooms cleaned and aired, so, though they were cold and unappealing on that afternoon now lengthening into evening, at least they were clean and did not feel damp. The tour continued down into the library, the billiard room, and the breakfast room. "From the indentations in this rug, I assume something has been removed from this corner," the new mistress observed crossly, indicating the space where her ladyship's desk had stood. She looked at Rosemary, waiting for a response. "Well, yes, as you say, ma'am, there was a desk there that belonged to Marianne's mother, and was willed to her." "I must say I find it very high-handed of you to have removed these items without my permission," said Mrs. Fairchild icily. "I wonder how you can have come to do it." "It was thought to be for the best, ma'am," was all Rosemary permitted herself to say. They passed through the hall towards the dining-room and salon, with the mistress commenting unfavourably again on the state of the walls. Luckily, she did not seem to associate this with the removal of another item of her ladyship's, for which Rosemary was heartily grateful. The dining-room, with its huge long oaked table seating 30, looked grand enough even for Mrs. Fairchild, who looked with approbation at the dark portraits of ancestors gracing the walls. The family's history was not an old one, the estate having been purchased by Marianne's great-grandfather after he had retired from making his fortune in the British East India Company. Although she never spoke of it, Rosemary's maternal grandfather, while impecunious, had been descended from a gentleman of the court of Queen Elizabeth, and her family was thus much older than that of her employers. Nevertheless, Mrs. Fairchild was pleased to direct her girls' attention to our ancestors, deliberately overlooking the fact that her own lineage went no further back than a grocer's shop. It did not stop there. Before taking a cup of tea in the salon, the mistress declared that she would see the kitchens. Rosemary knew that the cook and kitchen maids would be in the midst of dinner preparations, and tried to persuade her to delay this visit until tomorrow, but to no avail. The group clattered down the back stairs, and Mrs. Fairchild stalked into the kitchen just as the cook was whisking the mayonnaise for the sauce to accompany the cold trout. Anyone with this familiar operation knows it is a delicate one, and Rosemary would not have interrupted it. Not so the new mistress, who demanded to know what was going on, thereby requiring the cook to stop what she was doing, curtsy, and answer as best she could, thus effectively ruining the emulsification of the eggs and oil. It was not an auspicious beginning to what would, Rosemary felt, be an uneasy relationship. The cook was a lady of decided character, and was unlikely to take such interruptions calmly in the future. Mrs. Fairchild, however, dismissed her with a wave of her hand, and turned her attention to the Welsh dresser, which displayed the household china. The plates visible on the shelves were all chipped, a fact that Rosemary could easily have explained, since the good ones were stored in the cupboards underneath for when the master and his friends were there. The chipped china was used on a daily basis by herself and Marianne and the staff. "This china is in an appalling condition," cried Mrs. Fairchild, her eyes flashing furiously. "No doubt the good dishes have also been removed for Miss Marianne." "By no means, ma'am," replied Rosemary with great calm. "They are stored underneath and will be used for you and Mr. Fairchild, of course." She opened the doors of the cupboard and showed the stacks of plates, each carefully protected by a layer of straw. "See that they are, and let me say," she addressed the cook and her young helper, who was regarding her with scared, round eyes, "any broken china will be taken out of your wages, so watch what you are about." And with that she swept towards the stairs, and with her daughters scuttling behind, rose majestically upwards. The subsequent days brought no respite from Mrs. Fairchild's noisy interfering in every aspect of the running of the court. She demanded the still-room keys from Wilson, and having examined the log-book which recorded the extraction of each bottle from the cellars, declared she would keep future hold of it. The butler, who for years had taken a small glass of port at night before retiring, a fact of which Rosemary was well aware but did nothing to stop, saw his future becoming less comfortable. She spoke to the gardener who was just preparing to plant the spring bulbs and instructed him where to put what, when he, who had been working at the court since he was a boy, knew better than anyone which plantings prospered best where. With her lively sense of the ridiculous, Rosemary was amused rather than dismayed by most of this crass interference. But she knew it was only a matter of time before Mrs. Fairchild discovered where her ladyship's furniture had been stored and demanded its return. Accordingly, she wrote to the Earl to inform him that the amount of furniture needing to be transported to Hythe House was greater than he had probably expected, and to tell him, though without much hope of intervention, that she was afraid Marianne's legacy from her mother might be appropriated by the new mistress of Fairchild Court. What his lordship wrote to Mrs. Fairchild in response she would never know, but it is sure that a letter with his seal arrived and was conveyed to her at the breakfast table one morning shortly before their departure. It was just as well, since only the day before the bedroom set, the desk, the fire screen and the mirror had been discovered under their Holland covers in the outbuilding. "So this is what you meant, Miss Drover, when you said these items were no longer in the house," exclaimed the mistress. "Be sure your slyness has found you out. I shall need to see chapter and verse of the will before I accept the removal of these things from the court." As she perused the single-page missive from his lordship, red spots appeared on Mrs. Fairchild's cheeks, and she was heard to suck in her breath. When her husband asked what the matter was, she replied with an assumption of ease that it was nothing, only a kind letter from Marianne's guardian confirming certain issues. But no further reference was made to her ladyship's furniture. Indeed, she hardly spoke to either Rosemary or Marianne again until the day they left. On the 30th of the month, the first conveyance to arrive at Fairchild Court was a good-sized cart drawn by 2 huge horses. Before it could get to the front door, Rosemary, who had watched all morning and guessed it was for the furniture, quietly directed one of the footmen to lead it directly around to the shed and help load it. She did not want Mrs. Fairchild aware of what was happening, as she would certainly have interfered or forbidden the footman to help. She had already had her and Marianne's few possessions brought down into the hall. She herself had 1 small trunk, and Marianne a trunk and a couple of band boxes. Their cloaks and bonnets lay over them. Shortly before noon his lordship's post-chaise arrived. This was a splendid, shining black and gold vehicle, drawn by 4 black horses, their tackle brightly polished and their manes closely braided. The doors bore the Wyvern coat of arms, a black griffin rampant on a field of gold surmounted by a series of wheat sheaves. Emblazoned beneath was the motto Semper Juremus Villam atque bello, which Rosemary, not for nothing a scholar of languages, was able to interpret, "From farm to battle we will always endure." There was a coachman and a postilion in front, and 2 grooms behind, all in full livery that bore the same crest. Marianne and Rosemary looked on in amazement, while behind them the 2 girls shrieked, "Mamma, mamma, come and see! It must be a prince! Does he have a glass slipper for us to try?" "Don't be ridiculous, girls, and where is your decorum? Don't shriek like that. Anyone would think you had no upbringing at all." Rosemary was thinking exactly that, and sure Marianne felt the same. She turned and gave her a conspiratorial smile. His lordship, descending from his coach, saw the smile, and for the first time regarded Miss Drover with a flicker of interest. She still looked as awful as ever, in her shapeless brown-grey gown. Could it be sackcloth? And ill-fitting cap. Did she actually have any hair? But her smile had momentarily transformed her. Marianne, her flaxen curls hanging prettily behind her head, in a travelling gown of amber wool that reflected her nut-brown eyes, now shining with unshed tears, looked absurdly young and pretty. The Earl was not looking forward to riding over 4 hours with a schoolgirl and her duenna, but he consoled himself with the fact that at least one of them was nice to look at, even if she was going to be tearful. "My lord!" Mrs. Fairchild came bustling forward. "How kind of you to come personally to escort dear Miss Marianne to her new home. I'm sure we shall all miss her dreadfully, and Miss Drover too, of course." Since this lady, jealous of Marianne's prettiness beside her daughters, who had both inherited her unfortunate nose and gingery complexion, had in the last week only spoken to her to criticise and to Miss Drover not at all, Rosemary glanced at her charge with another smile. This too was not lost on his lordship, who, nonetheless, executed a graceful bow in the direction of Mrs. Fairchild, muttering, "Madam, your most obedient," and at that moment the loaded cart appeared from behind the house. "Our trunks are in the hall, my lord," said Miss Drover. "Perhaps—" She led the cartman and the footman to where their trunks and few bandboxes lay. She and Marianne caught up their cloaks and put on their bonnets. Marianne's was a fetching poke front with a feather that matched her gown and cloak, both made by Rosemary from a length of material discovered in lavender in the attics. Rosemary's was the same black shapeless one she had arrived in 5 years before. As the 2 trunks and few bandboxes were loaded, the Earl reflected that he had never travelled with women with so little luggage. His light of loves inevitably not only weighed down the post-chaise with box upon box, but also seemed to find it necessary to turn back at least twice for items unaccountably forgotten. His mother had needed an entire carriage for her things when she went away for just a few days. These 2 were leaving here forever and had practically nothing. To his surprise, he experienced a momentary pang. "But will you not stop for a light luncheon, my lord?" cried Mrs. Fairchild, much to Rosemary's astonishment, for she had heard her previously announcing to her husband that she was not going to put the household about to provide a meal for this lord, whoever he may be. But his lordship refused. "Thank you, no. We will have to change horses in 2 hours, and we'll take something then. I don't want to keep them standing much longer, so if you're both ready—" Rosemary and Marianne both turned and looked at Fairchild Court, silently bidding adieu to their home. They curtsied to Mrs. Fairchild, then to Mr. Fairchild, who had just emerged from the library and stood blinking like some sort of animal unaccustomed to the light, and went towards the carriage. No affectionate farewells were exchanged. His lordship handed each of them up in turn, then stepped up himself. The groom put up the steps and closed the door. "Put 'em along, John," said the Earl, and they were off. So that was the first 2 chapters of my new novel, Rosemary, or Too Clever to Love, which is presently on pre-order on Amazon at 99 cents, and I hope you enjoyed it and will consider looking at my other 2 novels, and you can listen to the first chapters of those if you go to my website, romancenovelsbyglrobinson.com. Thank you.